Hello everyone, this is the start of a new series I'm doing. We'll get one per set, but since we're already in set 8, or set 9, I figured I would do all of the background ones to catch up. So this series is going to be based around kind of my tier list, based on kind of my own preferences and stuff like that, and my own criterias, and go over cards to watch for each set. So just wanted to kind of do a briefer version as we do catch up to where we're at now. So to start off, what do I do for ranks and what are the kind of things that can get a card a good rank? This is leaders and for characters. Does the card make me think is probably the first one. I like playing interesting cards and interesting leaders. So if a card can make me think, that's a good sign. I do have bias towards characters I like from the show, so that's always going to play into it. Next thing would be, is there anything interesting that the card itself does that is unique to it in a way that allows you to do things that you couldn't do in another way? And then finally, does the card have a room to get any better? And there's some cards that are pretty type locked and pretty narrow, and I have a difficult time getting better. But now with that out of the way, let's get into it, starting with OP01. So the way I'm going to do all of these is I'm going to start with the leaders tier list, and then I'm going to do some kind of cards to watch. So as you can see here, we have our first S tier leader, Red Green Law. Being honest, this is probably my favorite leader in the game, and it is its ability and the character, everything about it is just so good. So trying to keep this brief, I will kind of leave it at that. Next in A tier we have Blue Purple Crocodile. This is one that I always come back to and I'm always trying to make work. The event focused decks are something that I really hope that the game eventually gets right, but we haven't gotten there yet, and until we do, I'm going to keep aiming for this leader. Next in B tier we have Odin. I think his leader ability is quite interesting and kind of expanding out on what you can use for your Dawn per turn. The cost is pretty high though, but I think that with Wano, it's a popular enough arc to where it'll eventually get the support it needs to really investigate this leader. After that we have Red Green Luffy. Red Green Luffy I feel like is a pretty good baseline leader. Its leader ability is pretty niche, but I think it has a lot of power in it. We just need a good Straw Hat type character with a good reason to restand. Something like a Cavendish that can't just be abused by other leaders. Something unique to this leader. And then finally in B tier we have Doflamingo. I know this one gets real boring as we've gotten to now, but I wanted to kind of reflect in here how this leader has always kind of been for me, even before this starter decks. If I wasn't playing Red Green Law in the early sets, I was usually trying to make Dofi work, and it was a very fun deck. So I wanted to reflect kind of that it will fall probably the longer the I keep track of this tier list, but out of respect for where I kept it. Into C tier, these decks just don't quite strike as much interest in me. Zoro, I think, is a deck that has such a good baseline things that it'll always be somewhat relevant, but in the same way that it is a good baseline, it's also not that interesting. And then Blue Purple Kaido, it's just not one that ever clicked with me. I can get the idea for the deck, but it really never quite reaches the place I need it. And then finally in D tier we have King. His leader ability is just not interesting for me. He just doesn't have enough, and a lot of people will put him all the way in F tier just because his usability and everything. He just doesn't quite get there for me. Moving on to cards I always look at when I'm evaluating new sets. Nami and In 2 Years and Saboti are really good staple Straw Hat searchers. We all know that our protagonists are going to show up in every single set and they're always going to be good. So I always like to keep in mind what searchers I have available to me, and these are top of the line. Kinemon is another card that I think his effect is unique enough, and I think if we get a good Odin leader or some other good Scabbards characters, I think there's some real potential for him to be good. I'm really interested to see what happens with the newer upcoming kind of top half and bottom half Kinemon cards coming up. The next one, which should be no surprise, based on how well I rated Red Green Law, I think the 5-drop Law is one of the more interesting cards in the game, and it really enables some fun and interesting gameplay. The next two I put on the list because I think Baroque Works is one that will continually get revisited, and then the blue or the 7-drop Crocodile I feel like is it's a unique effect that if we ever do find that event focused deck, if it's in blue, it's going to be a real interesting thing. And it just has banish with a 1k counter. There's just a lot of things to like about it. And Miss All Sunday, while being locked to Baroque Works, I think this is the kind of card that is super useful and really can enable you to kind of play in a unique way that it doesn't get seen every way or all the time. Next one, Artificial Devil Fruit Smile. I'm not sure if they'll ever support it enough, but I will. I always watch, and my ears always perk up when I hear that there's a new Smile card, because this is just a real interesting card, and one of the few cards that searches your entire deck for you, which is an interesting, or with the support can do searching your entire deck. This one is just the top 5. The last one for OP01, this Yamato, double attack banish, always a good set of abilities, and so it's always got a good baseline. I think this card just needs a couple good ways to kind of get through opponents or have good protection, and there's definitely a real chance with that. And the alt art's beautiful. So I always try to watch for these cards when I'm evaluating new sets, finding ways to breathe new life into them. Next, moving on to OP02. No S tiers this time. In A tier, we have Garp. I think that this is one of the more interesting leaders because it doesn't have a good base of support. And I think that it makes it really interesting to try to play kind of building out a deck that doesn't have any intrinsic build-arounds to it. Next, we have Ivankov. I think the Impel Down package is quite strong, and it just needs kind of a fresh coat of paint, so to speak, and to reach up to the newer sets. So I really like that. And then his leader ability is one of the more interesting ones, where you have to kind of get down real low on your cards in hand, which can be a really interesting balancing act. Kinemon, I think, is probably a little less interesting than Odin because it is a little more narrow in that you know exactly what you're going to do with it, so it doesn't have as many kind of open ways to play it. But it is a very strong ability, and I think that the Wano card pool is interesting enough to justify this spot. Next in B tier, we have Zephyr Z. This one is one that I think maybe a little too power crept out, but I always like to evaluate it with each new set, just because the ability is real strong, and it's just a matter of getting around that downside. And if we can make it work, kind of being an interesting spot where he's both film and navy, I wonder if there isn't a future in where we could see some value out of this ability. Next one, this one is a weird one because I think I can recognize that this leader ability is actually quite weak, but it is interesting, and then it kind of pushes you to not play the strong cards, and I kind of value that in a deck. And Sanji's one of my favorite characters, so that's nice. Smoker, I feel like he's got enough interesting kind of baseline attributes for a black deck. And in addition to being a pretty cool character, he's got kind of a niche identity in the get something to zero, which I think that would be interesting if they fleshed it out a little more, kind of working around the idea of leaving a character on the board and just reducing its cost and not going all the way through with killing it necessarily. And I think that's kind of interesting and leads to, or leaves open some interesting design space. Then in C tier, we have Magellan. This is kind of an interesting ability. I just don't think that it is one that they're going to be able to flesh out too much in the future, just because down -1 is so common on so many purple cards that it is hard to build around it in a way that isn't pretty generic purple. So for that reason, he falls to C. And then finally, Whitebeard. He's not as low down as some might expect, just because I think that the kind of built-in timer effect on you is actually kind of interesting, can make the games more interesting than they might seem just being a powerhouse leader otherwise. I think in a world where pudding doesn't exist, or we have some better counterplay to pudding, I think Whitebeard is probably a really interesting leader to investigate. Moving on to the cards that I like to follow for OP02, Curly to Dan. One drop red cards are always going to be at least a little bit niche, or at least a little bit interesting, due to the rest of the support from OP02. And Curly is just one of those cards that if you have your Curlies and are always considering the fact that some of these one-drops are searchable, it makes for some pretty interesting stuff. And like I mentioned, when talking about Ivankov, I think the Impel Down package is quite interesting. Both Ivankov and Luffy kind of approach it in different ways, where they want you to get low in hand, which can make for an interesting balancing act. I do think, compared to the Magellan leader, I think that the Magellan character is one that is quite interesting in that how unique its effect is. I don't think we will see a world where it has too many competitors in its slot, just because I think that too much Don minusing on your opponent forced on them is probably one that's going to produce too many feel bads. But he'll always be interesting for that kind of niche ability to kind of throw off somebody's curve that they're not always anticipating. And then Garp is one that I think fits in a little bit in with the smoker idea of get something low, and fits with the Garp leader in a way that I think is kind of interesting. So I feel like this 2K with some neat kind of KO synergy could be one to watch if the meta ever becomes less hostile to these low drops. And finally, Kuzan, 10-drop Kuzan, is always going to be interesting because of the things that it can enable in other black decks. Just having a static -5 cost to all of their things is something that you always have to consider. And this is the kind of one of the cards that makes me think that there may be a world where Z can actually be interesting. Moving on to OP03 tier list. Ace in A tier here. I do think that Ace is one of the more interesting decks, and I was actually kind of disappointed that they didn't go further with the kind of midpoint between where we had Ace and we had Blue-Purple Crocodile and we had Miss All Sunday, and we kind of had a stack of cards that were event-focused in between red and blue. But Ace is a really good character. It's one of the decks that I really enjoyed playing at the time, and I think has got a lot of interesting mileage to it, especially with cards like Flame Emperor and such. Nami, this is one that is probably a little polarizing. I think that Nami is probably a card that is good for the game, that we need to have some amount of alternate win conditions to kind of prevent decks from boiling down to just good stuff decks, and having a way to kind of punish decks that just play best in slot cards all the time by really throwing the game into a different category is kind of interesting and necessary, I think, for the game. Iceberg being one of the first can't attack leaders is a really interesting kind of point in his favor, and I do think that he is a deck that maybe a little too type locked to ever see meta play, but is always one that I'd be exciting to evaluate a new set with, because your Water 7 and Galileo Company cards can always pop up and make an impact in this leader. Next in B tier, we've got Arlong. This one is interesting because I think that the trigger mechanic can be both a good thing for the game and a bad thing for the game. And I think that in a world where triggers can steal away some of the strategic depth, this as an alternate way of kind of using the mechanic can be interesting. And I could see a world where you get a character for Arlong that disables your ability to trigger cards from your life, but gives you a pretty strong buff for this leader. So in that case, I think it deserves the B from my criterias. Black Yellow Linlin is one that I've kept an eye on for a while. Just the intersection with yellow and black is kind of an interesting one, and she's kind of open in a way that some other decks aren't, that she has a synergistic ability with yellow, but not one that is overly prescriptive. So I kind of value that. Kuro, being kind of the de facto East Blue leader, I think there's some interesting cards that could that only really fit with him, and I keep my eyes open for East Blue cards every set. Moving on to C, the CP9 Lucci. Similar to how Kuro's got that double attack and kind of a thing, I would prefer CP leaders to be more like this one than the other Lucci, just because this is a little bit more interesting and I think a little prescriptive than the other ones. But ultimately, he ends up not being that inspired. And then I have category down in D tier. I do think that the yellow identity in the game is more interesting than Katakuri's general gameplay, and just going to 7K is generic enough that I think it is. It's just not inspiring. So. All right, moving on to cards I like to watch from 03. I think the KO Marco is kind of one of those blast from the past, real strong cards, and I really do think that it deserves to be kept on the radar because its ability is real strong, its stickiness. There are just a lot of things that make this card interesting and kind of a multi-role filler that you might not see otherwise. Flame Emperor, I do think that being locked into Ace, there's not going to be very often that it's going to be relevant, but I do think that we will get a world in which we get a new Ace leader, and I'm looking forward to it. Usopp being one of the few rush cards in blue, always going to be on my radar, and it's also the meme of have your one rush Usopp to get there. Next, 3000 Worlds. This is, I think, a removal spell that has not been power crept as much as people think. It is close in a lot of ways to Gravity Blade and to Red Rock, but I do think it has a niche that sometimes can't be filled by either of those, and it has the bonus of being a Straw Hat card, so any of our Straw Hat searching cards are going to interact positively with it. Isho, I think, is an interesting top-end card for black. One of the more so attacking hand rather than attacking board, and then giving that -3, which is useful for a lot of black leaders who may struggle otherwise with keeping a consistent amount of cost minus. And then finally, I have Soga King. This one being a bounce filter with a counter and a reasonable body, if a little overcosted for all of that. I think it just makes a very flexible card that probably just needs a good it's a very good slot piece. So there may be decks that you could slot this into that no other card could quite fill. So I like to keep an eye on that when I'm reevaluating new sets. Moving on to OP04, we have our next S-type or S-tier leader. Vivi is just one. It's the giving rush to things that don't have it is such a kind of it opens up so many avenues, and it fits real nice with the idea that the leader can attack. And as a character, I really like, so it gets an S tier, and that's how it is. Moving on to A tier, we have Yellow Purple Crocodile. I do have a soft spot for Baroque Works, and the Baroque Works stuff in purple has a lot of fun dimensions to it. I do wish that we got another Baroque Works leader that could fit with the purple stuff better, but that will be in time, I suspect, rather than, or I should say, it'll be a win, not an if, on future Baroque Works leaders. Next I have Rebecca in A tier. I think she's interesting. The can't attack ability really kind of puts her into a very interesting kind of role in the game where we don't see very often, which is that really long-lasting leader whose goal isn't to to kill you so much as to drain you of all of your resources before slowly kind of withering you away. And I think that that kind of gameplay can be interesting in moderation. But I think that it makes for a kind of interesting leader. The next in B tier, similar to how Rebecca is a grind you out kind of deck, Queen can also be with some of the interesting pieces that you're trying to control your hand size. The biggest downside for me, though, is the end game of just play 9-drop, swing with lead, gain 2 life is not quite as inspiring as some other leaders might be. And then also in B tier, we have Green Purple Doflamingo. He's got an interesting leader, and I do like that he leans into events more, which is unique for the game in general. So I respect that. Finally, in C tier, we have Isho. His abilities aren't as inspiring to me. I can see a little bit of the vision, but it's just not quite aligning, and the costs on them kind of really narrow his scope. Moving on, cards to watch. We have Sugar. I think this card is very strong and quite annoying, and it's definitely one that I think a deck that can abuse Sugar is going to be one that has some room to investigate. Next, we have Miss All Sunday. A little biased because it's a Robin card, but this one I think is a really interesting in how many different places it can show up in the game. Being a ramp card in purple when your leader if your leader maybe doesn't have as much, getting some card draw, and also having an interesting trigger, kind of hits a lot of boxes that I think are interesting and good to have on a card. The next one's pretty niche. This Color Strap card. It's a small counter, but also the rest a 4-cost or lower. I feel like there is room for a leader that could take advantage of this in a way to kind of survive the early game by giving you access to kind of a mini more controllable bedge. And I'm interested to see where that one could show up. Next one, the Black Gear 4 Luffy. I feel like this is one of the more interesting finishers in the game, especially when you compare it with the King Kong gun, where you can kind of really aggressively attack into your opponent's characters and then pivot into a win condition there at the end. Next, we have the Secret VV. This, like I mentioned with the VV leader, giving rush to things that don't normally have it is kind of a really interesting design space that can allow for a lot of different things. It being 7 costs and only 4K really limits where it can go, but I think if this card ever finds a home, it's going to make for a very interesting deck. And finally, for the set, the Secret Rosinante. I feel like this is the kind of card you need to think about every time there is a green 5-drop. It is a strong ability that can really protect maybe a pivotal card, and if we ever see enough green 5s that are kind of role fillers, this is the kind of card that I want to pay attention to. All right, moving on to OP05. I have Sabo, Red Black Sabo, in A tier. I feel like this ability is really interesting, and it's neat how it can kind of force a color into a weird spot with its protection ability. And in what is largely a pretty fair way to do it, with the cost of having the Dawn attached. And I think it's just an interesting leader. Rosinante, I think, is one of those cards that we want to find a world where that blocker ability pops up. It's just a kind of really interesting, really unique kind of game plan and play style that I think would be fun to have some support around. Purple Luffy I put up just because of how flexible he is. His guaranteeing ramp opens up potentially a lot of deck space in a purple deck, and the access to some extra cards at the cost of your life. I think just makes for a very flexible leader that you can kind of build around in a lot of ways. And just something to always evaluate new purple cards by. Bella Betty is one where every time you see a new Revolutionary Army card, if it's in these colors, it's definitely on the consideration block. And I think the ability for this one to go as aggressive as possible is kind of an interesting place. Sometimes you just need to hit face and hit it hard. So I put that there. D tier, we skip over C tier for this set, but go straight to D tier with Sakazuki. This leader is down here mostly because of how powerful it is. It is the kind of leader that is so unambiguously strong that it stops being interesting for me. It's definitely a interesting deck to play, but not one that's interesting to brew around. It's kind of find whatever the best cards in your colors are and kind of go from there, and that's just not as engaging of a gameplay as I'm interested in. And finally, in F tier, I genuinely don't like Enel's ability. I respect its place in the game, but I think that it being a deck that just frustrates opponents is just really one that kind of rubs me the wrong way. So I have it all the way down in F tier. Moving on to the cards to watch from 05, I think Karasu is a really important card to watch. Its second ability that's when attacking is not leader locked, which I think in a world where we could get rush on these red cards is really interesting. And so I put it in here because it's something I'm always watching. The One Drop Nico Robin, I think this is the kind of card that does just enough, and at that one cost, it's a card that I always will keep in mind when looking at new leaders and see if we can't fit that one drop package. This one would fit well with Cartilage Dan and such. And so it's something I like to keep an eye on. Fire Fist, similarly, is kind of a unique effect that it can KO. The -4 cost can be really relevant for red's removal, and it kind of is nice and flexible in that way. Following it, we have Houndblaze. I think this is a card that unambiguously needs to be monitored in every single blue-black leader, just because of how strong the ability to bottom deck a character and get the +3. It's just a card that you just have to be aware of. Similar to the Searchinami and In 2 Years card, I think this, when you're at Sea You Fight Pirates card, is one to keep an eye on, with Straw Hats being the most popular, well, the most common character type, and purple being more recently where a lot of them have shown up. And I think that acknowledging that this is a kind of card you've got to always keep in mind. Mancherry is, I think, one of the, it's a little underrated as a black card engine. There are several black decks that just don't use their trash as much as they could, and Mancherry is a really interesting way to kind of bring back some cards. It's got enough good restrictions on it to where it's not universally playable, and it's just enough costs to make it, I think, interesting for the game. Enel, the 7-drop Rush Enel, this leader, or this card, is obviously interesting in the Enel leader, which I don't think gives it too much points, but I think with the combination of the OP01 cards, this is one of the things that is just waiting for a leader that can help mitigate its downside on its ability, and then I think that this is one that can make for an interesting build around. And then finally, our effectively Rush Luffy. It's got such an interesting downside, and one that I think more decks probably could take advantage of if they were willing to risk the done -10, which I think is a pretty interesting piece. Moving on to set 6. In A here we have Perona. I think this is one of the more interesting and open-ended leaders that are out there. The abilities fit really nicely with both green and black, and so there's just a lot of mix and match what archetypes you want, and I think that can make for a real interesting leader. Reivew, I think, is one that is quite a bit more narrow, but it makes for some really interesting gameplay where you are constantly able to refresh and kind of go through cards and reuse them in ways that a lot of other decks can't. And I just find that gameplay kind of engaging. I'm really interested to see what happens with the Germa 66 archetypes going forward, and see what happens when we get a new leader, and see how they interact with the different tools that Reivew has right now. Next in B tier I have Moria. I think Moria is one of the more interesting black decks. I am looking forward to finding out where its balance lies and seeing what needs to get added to it to kind of reach the heights that some of the other black decks have. And I hope it's not in just a removal fashion. I hope it fits into like a black Doflamingo style deck where you can kind of get quite aggressive and just enough removal to make it a good aggro deck. Next, green yellow Yamato is real interesting just by the fact that it is a win condition in and of itself. Unlike a lot of other leaders, having access to double attack and that much pressure just on your leader opens up the rest of your deck to a lot of different options. The Fortress Yamatos we've seen, the Wano or Sky Island, there's just several different things, and I think that the leader doesn't point you in any of them particularly strongly, which makes for a very flexible deck, and it can make it a real good wild card. In C tier I have the Uta. I think the film package is really letting down Uta. I think this leader could be interesting if it just had better cards to be worth it. The density of film cards that you need to run just to make that leader ability reliable is just too high, and it just doesn't line up. And then finally in C tier we have Hody Jones. I think that the life prevention, life-taking prevention clause is one that is interesting. I just wish it had a little more application. I'd like to see maybe a multicolor leader, maybe green-yellow, that had something similar to this ability, which would be kind of interesting, I think. You might have to adjust it since it prevents you from paying costs as well, which kind of dampens its ability. But I would like to see a little bit more like Hody on a leader that wasn't just mono green and kind of focused in on a single archetype. 06 cards on my radar. Shariah, I feel like, is a card that proved that it is a strong card and is just looking for a home. It is the kind of card that is such a good baseline that it really is one to pay attention to when you're evaluating new sets. Arlong, similar to how Foxy, who we'll get to in a set or two, Foxy's leader ability, locking down an opponent's leader, there's just so many unique and strong things you can do with that ability. I think that keeping Arlong on your radar is good, just to try to acknowledge the power therein. Next, Tashigi, Navy Searcher, and the same reason I said with Nami Searcher, the same reason here with Tashigi for Navy Searcher. Navy's always going to be popping up. Blue seems to be a color where it's shown up more than once. Tashigi's always going to be something to think about. And just like with Houndblaze previously, the Amano, no, I'm not even going to try to say it. This sword one is one you always have to pay attention to. Not because it's necessarily interesting, but because it just takes another blue-black leader that's strong enough to break this one. Reivew on here, I think it's pretty obvious that it's a strong card. It's just something that is a little bit out of fashion for purple at the moment, being less than your opponent. And so I think it's one of the ones that people will forget about if not kind of pushed to the fore frequently. So I like to keep it on my own personal list of things to watch out for. Perona, this 4-drop, this is one of my favorite 2Ks to kind of just add into a black deck to spice it up a little bit. And just replace a Suru or replace a T-Bone or something like that and just throw in a Perona or two, just for the kind of neat little ways you can kind of use this toolbox 2K. And I just found that to be interesting and a thing. And finally, I don't think this one is going to be a surprise to a lot of people. This Sanji card is very strong, and it just needs ways to enable it. And so the blue-purple Luffy that we've seen for 11, I just hope that it can still make this Sanji card interesting, because if it gets too solved, it will stop being interesting. But until then, I still think it's a very interesting card. Moving on to OP07. In A tier, I have Boa. I think Boa is one of the cards. It's a very workhorse style ability where you play the game and you get value out of it. But I do think that the keep maintaining your hand size is one of the more interesting things that they've tried to work with blue. And I just think it's a great place for it. And the Kuja Pirates was an interesting archetype, even if it never quite caught on. Next, Vegapunk, I think his ability to be deceptively aggressive, also deceptively hard to kill, it just makes for an interesting kind of leader and a play experience. It's one I think that we will need to see where they take Egghead from here before we can evaluate him as like any better than where he's at on this tier list. But I think that there's definitely room for him to grow if they take the Egghead archetype in the right direction. If it just moves into another color and he's completely inaccessible to him, then that's obviously disappointing. But I think there's room for this leader to be quite interesting. Foxy, I think is just a tier below the other two just because of the needing 3 Foxy characters is a high enough hurdle to where I think he's one of those kind of pigeonholed leaders. His leader ability is quite interesting. He's got interesting downsides. The downside of needing 3 specifically Foxy type characters is the one though that I think is a little too hard to bear on average, which is kind of disappointing. Then moving into C tier, we have Dragon. His leader ability is just not all that inspiring. It is interesting that it works with attached on, which I think could be an interesting place to go if it was explored more. But at least for right now, it's just not as inspiring. Similarly, Bonnie's ability is just a really good baseline ability, but doesn't ask anything interesting of you. It just asks that you not spend all your Dawn, which is not that interesting of a thing. And then down in D tier, I think the problem with this Lucci is it gives you too many tools for free. You don't have to work for it a lot of the time. And it's also not like Sakazuki could be more interesting because at least you could express skill through it more. I feel like this Lucci ability, while the deck itself does require a fair bit of skill to navigate to its fullest, I think that the leader is not the piece of that deck that is the interesting. It's all of the moving pieces around it. The leader ability is just feeds all of those other moving pieces well. And I think it's kind of disappointing that the leader, when your leader doesn't interact in a more interesting way with the rest of the deck. So moving on to 07 cards to watch. I think the Freezing Jewelry Bonnie. I think this is a card, and we've started to see it more with the ability to turn off 10 drops. That's a really interesting ability that is one that I don't want to see too much, but it's really nice to see it. Just enough of it. And I think that makes this card in particular a pretty neat card. Next one I have is this Hawkins. I think just how he has his protection ability is really interesting, and it forces your opponent to play differently. And I kind of value that in a card to kind of push interesting decisions onto your opponent too. This Boa card I think is one that has a high enough baseline and a strong enough ability that I will always keep an eye on this one, even if it doesn't always find a home. I think it's one to keep in mind, and the kind of card that synergizes well with designing your top end to deal with the idea that something is frozen. And I find it to be a pretty interesting card. Nightmare Luffy, another, I think, very interesting card. I do like that it's a when attacking, kind of adjusting and kind of forcing you to plan around it more because you can't get that value out of it right away. I just find it to be a kind of interesting card to play. Iroquois Help. This is one where one of the cards that I think is the reason I want them to be careful and to be interesting with the way they take Egghead from here. I think if this card just gets to be generic free value, it's not as interesting. But if you can do interesting things with the trigger in ways that kind of can transform the table from just generic, oh, I just get value for my triggers, into something more dynamic and more something you play around. I think that could be interesting. And finally, Sabo. I put this one on here because I think that black, in a world where Moria consistently threatens to be the best card in the game, I think being aware of what your top end options are after Moria goes is valuable. So I always like to watch, because I think this Sabo is quite strong as a top end card. It's got an interesting Revolutionary Army type, interesting character. I think there's definitely some room to see this card get better. Moving on to OP08. A tier, I have Marco. This is a very good leader. I really do like this guy. He hits a lot of things, synergizes nicely with all of his, with both of his colors, and in a way that is not overwhelming, like maybe a black CP0 Lucius, where you have to think about it. You have to put more thought into how you want to leverage it, and there's a lot of small things that you can get out of it, and I really appreciate that. B tier, I think Carrot is interesting, and I think that the requirement of having a mink is interesting enough to differentiate it from a Perona or a Bonnie. And I just hope for a world where there's more minks and this can be a more interesting leader. I really appreciate Chopper as an alternative to Zoro, in that it is not quite getting the generic Zoro ability, but getting something that in a lot of cases can feel just as strong, and having the interesting restriction of playing with animals, which I think is kind of an interesting thing. There aren't a ton of animals, but there are quite a few, and it doesn't hurt that Chopper is a very popular character, so we'll always be looking for more Choppers. King is one I have not gotten to play myself, but I think that the ability and managing Dawn carefully is kind of an interesting aspect of this leader that I'd like to get into at some point. And I think that the black Animal Kingdom Pirates is interesting in a way that I haven't gotten a good chance to dig into. Pudding, on the other hand, it's the flip. Your life is, there's room for it to be interesting. It just hasn't struck with me. And the, in some sense, obvious design or card deck building decision to put in 10 moms kind of disappointing. But that's okay. I still think it's a pretty decent baseline leader ability. Kalgara, this card is just waiting for more Shandian warriors. It's at its current spot is just so one note that it's hard to get excited about. But I think in a world where we get more Shandorian warriors, this could be a much more interesting leader. So that's why I have him at C and not lower. Moving on to the cards I'm watching from OP08, Tony Chopper. I think this guy is an interesting card. He's got enough limitations to where he's not oppressively flooding board, but kind of a really strong, aggressive card that I like to pay attention to. And he's Chopper. There's nothing wrong with that. Electrical Luna. I think this is a very strong card that just needs the right home. It is very strong control card, but it does not have quite the support it needs. So I'm just watching for the moment when it does. Ace. This one is quite interesting. I do like that it is a Doflamingo-ish effect without being Doflamingo. Kind of harkening back to earlier Doflamingo, where you had to work more and you had to think more about how to use your leader ability, and I respect that. I am looking forward to the rumored blue Whitebeard Pirates leader in the future. Charlotte Pudding, similar to the 5-drop Eustace Kid, but I think a little more interesting because it comes in rested, so it's a little harder to abuse. But I do think that this ability is one that is valuable and could make for a very interesting purple deck in the future. The Kaido 9-drop, again, like I said with Sabo, I like keeping my eye on backups to Moria when, or if he ever gets banned, and I think Kaido is one of the more interesting ones. I do like the discard too. I'd like to see Black lead more into discarding from your opponent's hand than just KOing on their board. But I don't know how you make it to where a deck doesn't just load up on both. So I don't know about that. S-Snake, similar to the Boa, I think that freeze or can't attack ability is interesting and can make for some interesting deck building ideas to freeze their characters instead of KOing them so that you can set up for a bigger combo in the future. And it having trigger and working well with the egghead abilities, I think is one to be on watch for. 10-drop Kaido and Linlin, the Wombo combo ability of this card is so nice and something that I will watch for opportunities to make it happen. It's a very strong ability to watch for. So on my watch list. Finally, I'm going to go over the OP01 and the starter deck leaders and the promo leaders. I think there's one missing here now that I'm looking at it, and that is the blue Luffy promo. And I would probably put him in B tier. Interesting ability, not unique enough to make me go after him over maybe some other blue leaders. But starting with the A tier, the only reason why Red Purple Law is not an S tier leader, in my estimation, and again, in my preference, is the fact that it's too strong. This is a leader that would have stayed in S tier if it had not power crept its way into its spot where it needed banning. So it's dropped down to A. Its ability is still very, very interesting, and I love that style of deck. It's just a touch too far. Blue Yellow Ace, I think that this one has just enough restrictions and also an open enough avenue to have room for growth. 5-drops are always going to be coming out, and so it's just a matter of finding how do you use the top card of your life before the end of your turn, and finding that balance is, I think, pretty interesting. Next on to Sanji, just like with Vivi, I think that giving rush to things that don't normally have rush is a really interesting ability. His only downside compared to Vivi is he's only one color, and red is already the color that has the most rush. So, if he were pretty much any other color, he'd probably make it up to S tier. But in red, he's just an A tier. Red Yellow Sabo, another one quite interesting. Interesting game plan too, compared to BY or other leaders. I find it quite engaging the way his game plan works, and it makes it it does make one of those interesting puzzles for your opponent. How do they progress against your life while not just feeding into your ability to just rush them down? And that makes for an interesting dynamic. Red Purple, I think the 3 life 6k is a really interesting kind of payoff spectrum, and I think that he just does it well. I think the addition of Gum Gum Giant maybe makes the decks a little less dynamic, but I think on the whole it's still quite an interesting one. Finally, in the A tier, Zoro and Sanji. I think this leader is one that just needs to find its footing or find the right meta. It's a really interesting leader. Fits in with the law style. Get in a bunch of attacks, pick up your guys, reuse the same guys several times. It's just soft to removal in a way that I think is hard for it to resolve right now. Moving on to B, I have the ST14 Luffy. I really like the kind of angle of black being expensive guys, but we just haven't had it get all the way through. There's not quite enough support for it to stand up to the other black leaders, but I do think that's an interesting. Red Purple Kid, I think the amount of aggro you can get out of this with the interesting downside is really kind of a neat combination that I think is one that I will watch in the future as more Kid Pirates come out. Red Green Odin, I think the giving counter to non-counter cards is an ability I would like to see on other leaders as well, because I think it makes for an interesting niche for some cards and some archetypes that have a lot of duds. And I do respect the go to 6k conditionally leader ability. Yellow Mom I find just way more interesting than Katakuri, but at the end of the day it is not going to get too much higher than that because it's a Big Mom Pirates deck. There is kind of a built-in way that you want to play these to a certain extent. Hannibal I find less interesting than Ivankov as an Impel Down leader. I can appreciate the ability to ramp really aggressively, which is sometimes makes for an interesting thing. It's just, I think if I were playing Impel Down, I would prefer to play Ivankov. Kairos is one that I want to work. I think that the interesting ability to use your leader for removal with a kind of a meaningful hoop to jump through makes for a kind of interesting balance. Purple Kaido I have here mainly because Burning Life is really uncommon in the game, and I'd like to see it balanced well, and I think he does well, and would like to see where his style ability goes in the future. ST1 Luffy, this is a really good baseline leader that has just enough kind of flexibility to kind of tick the boxes to get into B tier. Yellow Yamato and C tier here. I really wish that there was just a little more juice on this leader, or just a little bit more that could be squeezed out of this leader. And I do hope that at some point in the future we can find a kind of a way to kind of feed into that 6k ability to get to 6k in a productive way. Green Kid, playing against this leader, not fun for me, at least. But I can appreciate the idea similar to Green Yellow Yamato, of having your leader be a win condition completely on its own. And I think that can make a very flexible deck, which is why it can get up to C tier here. D tier for the Black Luffy. This ability, while different, it just plays into Black's strengths of just KOing things, and I don't feel like it does it necessarily in all that interesting of a way. Purple Shanks, if it was more open to things other than just film type characters, I think there'd be a lot of room for this one to go up, but as of now, it's just a little too narrow. Finally, in the F tier, there are several F tiers for the rest. I think that BY Luffy is one of the least fun decks in the game, just by how dramatically it can get out of hand. And while I appreciate that it is hard to get into those things, it feels like it's not uncommon for the game to really sit down to how many times can BY play Moria, and your opponent does not have as much agency as I would like them to be able to have. Similar to how NL works, if your opponent playing either BY or NL draws well, sometimes it's nigh impossible to get through, because your timing attacks, if you don't hit it on the first time and they're prepared for the first time you try to get them, then the game's over at that point, and I find that not very engaging. I think of any individual leader that I would have eroded or removed from the game, BY Luffy would be it, just because of the kind of, you have your one moment to kill them, and if you don't succeed, then it's just a matter of, did they draw? How many Morias did they draw? Also in F tier, this Black Sakazuki, he's just too bad of a deck. All of the black decks do things better than him and do it in more interesting ways. I just don't find his ability interesting. And then Red Uta here, I have it all the way at the bottom, not because it's not all that interesting, which it's not, but because its ability is just so vastly outclassed by everyone else in the game that there's not a real way to make a functional deck that cares about using her ability. And I think that's kind of disappointing. Finally, getting into the cards for the rest of the things, the non base sets. So the first one I have here is the ST01 Nami. I had to choose the most interesting art, the one that'll draw the most attention. But this is a card that I think having the ability to expand your Dawn is just really, I think, the glue piece that can really turn decks into something interesting. And so I appreciate that. The unblockable Luffy. Always got to keep this one on mind. It is such a great finisher. All it needs is the ability to push your opponent low. And I guess I probably should have put Jabal Jambe on here too. I think both of those cards are cards that you always have to keep on your radar as things to do. Next, the ST04 King. I think that this card really is just waiting for the right leader for it. I think that it's got a very strong ability. You just need to find a deck that isn't too harmed by the -1 Dawn, and that wants to play the Animal Kingdom Pirates, realistically. And it's just one that I keep on my radar. Douglas Bullet is very, very strong, but has a very defined downside. So I think finding the balance between those two is more interesting than maybe some other top-end cards. So I always like to watch for opportunities to play him. Similarly, this Smoker, I think that it hits a lot of marks, and the downside to it is it doesn't fit black as well as a lot of other cards do. But I'm interested in finding a deck where this is the right choice. Emporio Ivankov, this 3-drop from the Zorosanji deck. I think the most interesting thing about this is a card that wants to bring an entire package along with it. And I think that that's kind of interesting, being able to find a niche where you can bring one card that justifies bringing on a whole host of other cards, and I think in an interesting way. The 5-drop Rush Ace, I think this one is just one to keep on your radar as a good finisher that is probably easy to forget because it's the least impactful from that set of 5-drops. It's not as common in BY, and it is just kind of a baseline card, but I think that it is definitely a very nice card to keep in mind. Viola is a card I think that is real interesting, and I think that once we get more cards that can really take advantage of the flip your life face up costs, I think that this one will be an interesting one to keep in mind. Getting into a promo card, this is one I've tried to make work on several occasions, and I think is quite interesting. It's just finding a way to get it working. The on play, if your opponent has 6 or more cards in their hand, your opponent adds 1 card from the top of their life to their hand. Burn on your opponent's having cards, so it's interesting in that you could have a some tension between keeping your opponent capable of countering you, but also pushing at their life. And I think that that's kind of an interesting tension to keep in mind, and one that I'd like to see find a way through at the end. And then finally, I have this Hina. I think this Hina is similar to the Nami card in a lot of ways, but just kind of fitting that black. Like I mentioned with Manchuri, I think there are several black decks that don't use their graveyard to the fullest, and getting that extra Dawn on your leader can be relevant. And being hard to move and sticky and efficient body, I think is just one that's got a lot of things in its favor, and one that I like to keep on my radar. So to summarize the leader tier list, here's the whole thing. Wanted to kind of leave that here so you guys can kind of see where my evaluation from my own opinion shows up for these leaders, and kind of what I want to play. I will get into I'll leave this up here another moment or whatever, so anyone looking can grab that. Moving on to the end, thank you guys for listening. I know it's been a slog getting through this whole video, but I appreciate you guys and your support, and I will be, assuming this does well, and if you guys are interested, please comment down below to kind of confirm if you guys like the style of video, and then I will be planning on doing one for each set from going on. So much shorter videos, but I'll go much more in depth with the leaders and stuff like that. I wanted to kind of push through this one quickly because we had so much to cover. But in the individual set versions, we'll go into more depth with the cards to watch and the leaders, and I hope you guys would like that. I will try to do the OP09 one, which with our favorite leader Robin in it. You guys can guess where she'll probably find herself, but I'll try to do that in sometime in February. So look out for that, and then in March, before the set comes out, I will plan to do the one for OP10. So looking forward to continuing this series, and thanks again for listening to my blab. I will talk to you guys again in the next one. Bye.